Warning: this is a story of bias and cruelty, reflecting a reality that many face every day. We invite you to discuss, to support each other, and to realize that change begins with each of us. The night was dark and quiet when rough words rang out on the deserted street, piercing the tense silence. The young girl had not expected that this evening would turn into a real nightmare, a nightmare from which she would not be able to escape. The policeman, ignoring her fear, judged her not by her actions, but by her appearance, by the color of her skin. His every action screamed disdain and contempt, and his cold, heavy hands clutched her shoulder as if she were nothing to him. But he didn't know who her father was. He didn't know that her father was a man who could stop such acts of injustice, a man who was used to standing on the side of truth and justice, and a man who would stop at nothing to protect his daughter. Friends, this story is about truth, pain, and struggle. Please share your thoughts. Write in the comments what your name is and what city you are watching us from. This is important for us because each of you helps to promote our channel. You inspire us to create these stories and raise our voices against injustice. You are our support, our strength. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions make us stronger. Help us to bring the truth to more people. Thank you for that. We hope that together we can make this world a little fairer. Evening had fallen on the city with a calm, foggy blanket, and the streets were silent. Only the sparse lights of street lamps caught the lonely figures of passers-by hurrying home. Dana, a young girl with expressive features and eyes full of life, was returning home. She loved such evenings when the city seemed to breathe quietly and measuredly, allowing her to forget the bustle and anxiety. The light wind played with her long curls, and she felt calm, lulled by the silence. But something in the air was unusual, as if the night itself had warned her of danger. Dana was crossing a deserted street when she felt someone's eyes on her. At first, she thought it was just a passerby, a random person, but as she turned her head, she noticed the figure of a policeman standing nearby, staring at her intently. His gaze was hard, assessing. There was more than curiosity in it, something dark lurking there, something that sent shivers down her spine. The policeman walked slowly toward her, and with each step he took, something in the back of Dana's mind warned of danger. Her heart raced, and a whirlwind of anxious thoughts swirled in her head. Why is he coming toward me? I haven't done anything. But the policeman kept approaching, his eyes fixed on her as if he saw her as a criminal. When he stepped closer, Dana frowned, not knowing what to say or how to respond. She knew she was obligated to answer politely, trying not to provoke his anger, but her hands were shaking and her voice caught in her throat. The policeman, still staring at her, crossed his arms and asked with cold disdain, as if her presence was suspicious in itself, "Where have you been, girl?" His tone sounded as if he already knew the answer and despised her for it. She tried to explain that she was coming home from a meeting with friends, but his gaze only grew harder, colder. The policeman scrutinized Dana, and his face contorted involuntarily into an expression of contempt as he caught the color of her skin. In his eyes, she was no longer just a passerby, but something suspicious, alien, and dangerous. He stood there like an animal smelling prey, looking at her not as a person, but as a problem to be solved before it turned into trouble. He didn't need to know anything about her. He had already made up her story, painted the image of a criminal in his head. He took a quick, hard look at her from top to bottom, noting the simple jacket, the sweatpants, the ragged backpack. In these details, he saw only confirmation of his own prejudices. In his mind, she could not be a decent person. The policeman smirked, a flicker of hardness and power in his eyes that he was about to abuse. "Where are you going so late in the day?" he asked, stretching his words, as if he knew in advance that her answer wouldn't matter. There was a strange, dangerous note in his voice, and Dana felt her heart clench with fear. She tried to answer calmly, but the policeman interrupted her, raising his voice. "Maybe you're the one keeping an eye on things. Are you one of those people who watches other people's houses? You thinking of breaking in?" She frowned, stunned by the unfairness and force of his words. Dana could feel his hostility even more, pulsing in the air between them. His words burned her, filling her with anxiety and pain, but she knew she had to remain silent. The policeman didn't want to listen to her. He wanted only her silence, her fear to confirm his authority. He stood so close that his heavy breath was barely perceptible against her face, a reminder of the utter superiority he possessed. Her desire to leave, to simply disappear into the night, was becoming unbearable, but his still figure and his fixed, angry gaze made it impossible to make a move. The policeman stepped forward with a grim expression, covering the street as if she were a real threat, not a lonely girl returning home. His gaze was contemptuous, and his voice was as cold as a block of ice, ready to crush her with a single word. "Stop," he said sharply, as if commanding someone who didn't deserve even a hint of respect. "Where are you going in such a hurry?" Dana frowned, not knowing what to say. She realized that any word she said could backfire on her, could fuel the fire of his anger and hostility. But silence only fueled his aggression, as if he was waiting for something from her to justify his actions. "Did you learn to talk?" He smirked rudely, and there was an unconcealed disdain in his voice. "Or is it just the way it is in your neighborhoods, where you're used to not talking to the police?" Every word he said was a blow, a wound that opened up pain and resentment in her soul. She tried to explain herself, to say that she was just going home, that she hadn't done anything wrong, but he wouldn't listen. He interrupted her every word with another barbed phrase that had no hint of understanding. "Home, you say?" he repeated with a sneer, crossing his arms over his chest. "You look like you're looking for trouble to me, or maybe you're hiding something, drugs, or maybe stolen goods." His words were full of suspicion and implicit threat, as if he'd already passed judgment on her. He leaned closer to her, his voice even more sinister. "I know your kind. First they go out at night, sniffing around, looking out, and then they complain when they get caught red-handed. So come on, show me what you got in your backpack. You think I believe you?" He didn't even give her a chance to object. He already saw her as someone untrustworthy, someone who belonged to a dangerous, untrustworthy group he thought he knew everything about. In his eyes, she was already a criminal, one of them, whose only destiny was to wander the streets suspiciously, undermining society. The policeman suddenly reached out, grabbing her shoulder sharply, and his strong fingers dug into her skin, leaving no doubt of his intention to demonstrate his power. Dana felt pain, and fear gripped her with renewed intensity. She realized there was nothing she could do, that it wouldn't stop until it had broken her completely. "Come on, open the backpack," he ordered coldly, keeping his hateful gaze on her. The policeman examined her from head to toe, his eyes glittering with coldness, his expression like a predator who had already found a weakness in his prey. Dana stood before him, shivering, her shoulder aching from his rough grip, but he didn't let go. His grip was heavy, demonstrative, as if he wanted to leave a mark on her forever, a reminder of his power, of his rightness, which he didn't doubt for a moment. "What were you doing here so late, beautiful?" His voice was mocking, lingering like poisonous honey. "You're waiting for your friends, aren't you? Or maybe a client," he added with faint innocence, making it clear that he suspected her of something lewd. Dana looked up, unable to believe her ears. He was humiliating her more and more with each word, and each innuendo was deeper than the last. Her heart pounded, and shame and helplessness boiled in her soul. She tried to object, but he only laughed louder, making her attempt to explain herself look like a pathetic excuse. "Why don't you say something?" He leaned closer, and Dana could smell his cheap tobacco and sweat. "Oh, you're embarrassed, aren't you?" His face broke into a contemptuous grin. "Why are you walking here alone if you're so modest? People like you don't usually come home at night. You think I don't know?" He turned her toward him like a doll, holding her by the shoulders so that she was looking straight into his eyes, which were filled with dark mockery and malice. His every word sounded like a sentence, like an accusation for which he needed no proof. He had long ago decided for himself that she was one of those whom he was accustomed to see only in his lowest, most contemptuous estimation. To him she was only an image, a pattern he had long ago learned to disregard and hate. "You're probably from a neighborhood where it's never even light, aren't you?" He grinned, looking at her as if she were standing in front of him in dirty, tattered clothes. "Maybe you found some work back there, in the back alleys, and you're here to pick up clients. You don't think anyone's gonna notice?" His words fell on her like blows, each one burning and wounding, as if he were trying to erase her dignity, her right to respect. He didn't see her as a person, just a reflection of his preconceived beliefs and stereotypes. In his eyes, she was one of those he thought should be controlled, suspected, supervised. "Maybe you have something with you? What's in the backpack?" he asked, as if he already knew the answer. He quickly moved from insults to direct accusations, not bothering to look for the truth. "Show me what you're hiding. I wouldn't be surprised if it's something I should hold you for. I mean, that's what you do, right?" Every word he said made her feel more and more vulnerable, as if her existence was a humiliation and her life something suspect and unnecessary. Passers-by began to appear around, people hurrying home, wrapped in coats and scarves, their faces full of fatigue and indifference to other people's troubles. They glanced at the scene playing out in the dark street, but no one stopped. There was something detached in their glances, some silent agreement with what was happening. No one wanted to intervene. None of them wanted to meet her eyes. Dana stood in front of the policeman, and he kept fixing his gaze on her, as if he were looking at something low, shameful. People around them quickened their steps, trying not to linger too long, but everyone who passed by gave her a quick, disparaging glance, as if they saw her as a criminal caught red-handed. She was surrounded by invisible walls of stereotypes, prejudice, and fear that made her guilty in their eyes until she proved otherwise. The policeman, noticing the approach of the men, increased the pressure even more, as if deliberately intensifying the humiliation. He didn't need to utter loud accusations. His judgmental stare, his haughty posture, and his insulting innuendo spoke for him. His every gesture seemed to be a challenge, a declaration that he had every right to judge her here, on the street, in front of so many strangers, and no one should interface. Come on, don't be shy," he said loudly, pretending to address passers-by, but actually keeping his eyes on Dana. "That's how it always happens. They get a chance. And he paused and looked at her contemptuously from head to toe, as if she were something inferior and despicable. They still find a way to break the law." Those words, filled with malicious mockery and subtle mockery, hit her self-respect like stones. She wanted to object, wanted to scream, but her voice was trapped inside, crushed by the weight of shame and helplessness. Every word he uttered was like a sentence, and every glance the passers-by slid across her face was like another stroke to the image of her in their minds. The image of someone who, by their tacit agreement, could be humiliated, could be made to feel dirty and insignificant. The policeman noticed her desperation and, sensing authority, only grinned. "So, where are your friends now? Or are they all just like you? They probably know not to show their faces when the police show up," he said with a sneer. "You don't respect the law over there, do you?" The passers-by listened, trying to pretend they were not interested, but there was something dark and angry in their gazes. It seemed that, hearing the policeman's words, they began to judge her even more harshly, believing every accusation he made. People were whispering, casting slanted glances, whispering, as if her guilt was obvious, her place predetermined. She saw the faces of contempt and silent support for the policeman's actions, and her chest clenched with unbearable pain. Dana stood as if chained, and every glance, every whisper from passers-by was another blow, another wound. The policeman, enjoying his power, continued to press Dana as if she were a puppet to be manipulated at will. He skillfully used his uniform, his badge and privilege to crush her spirit and make her feel even more helpless. His every gesture, every word emphasized the inequality that made her feel as if she were on trial, where her guilt was predetermined before the proceedings even began. "You know," he said, leaning closer and lowering his voice to a whisper that sounded threatening in spite of its intimacy, "I could detain you right now. It wouldn't be any trouble at all, especially when I have proof, like yourself. You do realize that all those girls from disadvantaged neighborhoods usually can't resist temptation, right?" He said the words with such malicious certainty that Dana felt a chill run down her spine. He spoke of her as if she were nothing more than a set of stereotypes with not a shred of humanity in them. In his eyes, she wasn't a person, but a symbol of everything he hated and despised, and his job was to break her spirit by proving that she had no right to respect. "Do you think anyone will believe your words?" he continued, increasing his superworldly majesty with each word. "I'm a cop. I have power, and you have nothing. Your truth doesn't matter. I'm here to keep order, and people trust me, not you." His words burned like bright sunlight, highlighting her vulnerability. He spoke with such certainty that Dana felt as if she were trapped, and there was no way out. He was directly demonstrating how easily he could turn her life into a nightmare just because of who she was and the color of her skin. With each passing moment, his sullen face filled with more aggression. The policeman stepped toward her, pressing her against the wall of a building that happened to be nearby. And at that moment, Dana felt not just helpless, but humiliated. "You think I don't know what kind of entertainment people like you have?" he said, raising his voice so that those around him could hear it. adding hate to his words like fire. "You're not trying to hide the fact that you're just another troubled girl who's looking for adventure." Only his words came out louder, and her voice stayed inside, choked with fear. Dana was ready to burst into tears, but she knew that would only make things worse. The policeman, pleased by her silence, further solidified his dominance, giving his words as much weight as possible. He continued, already in the role of judge, "I suggest you just accept it, and believe me, you'll have less chance of being seen by the likes of me in the future, or you'll be unlucky enough to end up with the wrong kind of leniency." Those threats, uttered with ruthless ease, filled her soul with coldness. In that second, Dana realized he wasn't interested in her feelings or her story. He was a man with power, and in this world, his power determined who had the right to live and who had the right to die. She felt trampled, humiliated, as if her very essence was being questioned. The moment the policeman squeezed her shoulder again, Dana felt his hand was more than just a heavy weight. It was a symbol of his power and utter superiority. His fingers dug into her skin, leaving red marks, as if he were deliberately trying to imprint his aggression and humiliation on her. She trembled with fear, unable to move, as if this touch was draining her of blood, leaving only a feeling of utter helplessness. "Do you realize who you're talking to?" he said, leaning closer and looking her straight in the eye. His voice was rough and harsh, like metal against metal. "I can do anything I want to you, and no one will ask questions. Just look around, no one cares about people like you." His words sounded like a sentence, and every sound of them was an echo of the fear that burned her from the inside. She wanted to scream, but fear restrained her voice. In that moment, she felt utter frustration and despair, the realization that this man was using his power against her, not only physically, but mentally as well. He was the enforcer of his power, and she was the victim, bound to his whims. He squeezed her shoulder harder, and her breathing became ragged. Every second of the contact became an eternity, and she realized that this moment was more than just a physical touch. It was a brutal invasion of her personal space that tore at every boundary that defined human dignity. He wasn't just touching her, he was insulting her, intimidating her, mocking everything she represented. That touch was the point of no return. The moment she realized her life would never be the same again. She had fallen into a trap from which there was no escape. "What do you think will happen next?" he said, taking a step back, but leaving his sense of pressure behind. "Maybe you complain about how you've been mistreated, or maybe your daddy will take a swing at the police." He laughed, his laughter sounding cruel and cynical, as if laughing at her very essence. "Funny, isn't it? Who's going to listen to you? You're just another problem to be fixed." Dana clenched her fists, feeling tears come to her eyes. She couldn't let herself cry, couldn't show him how he was hurting her, how he was breaking her inner world, but his abuse was unbearable. Every look he gave her, every touch he gave her was full of contempt, and she realized he wouldn't stop. He simply enjoyed his superiority, his power, taking pleasure in her fear and humiliation. "I'm not forcing you to do anything wrong," he continued, as if he were taking the words out of her mouth. "All you have to do is admit your guilt and accept that you're not at home here. The problem is, there's no help for you in this world, no one to protect you. The only question is how you're going to live with it." She felt his grip loosen, but even in that moment, she couldn't feel relief. His words left a mark on her heart, a reminder of how deeply rooted racism and prejudice are in society. She realized that she was not only being humiliated, but she was being denied her right to a voice, to a choice, to hope. It was not just physical violence, it was the destruction of her inner world, her identity, her dignity. With every moment spent under the pressure of his gaze and words, Dana felt the hopelessness growing inside her. The policeman stood before her like a living wall, filled with hatred and prejudice, and her own voice, once strong, now merged with the hum of the evening city. She no longer knew how to defend herself, how to say anything to change the situation. Despair and fear settled in her heart. "Well, little one," he said with evident satisfaction, pausing for a moment to gaze into her tear-filled eyes. "What are you going to do? Run away? Or maybe you're hoping for your daddy to come and save you?" His laugh was full of anger, and his words pierced her like cold arrows. "I'm just going home," Dana whispered, her voice shaking with fear and bitterness. She tried to speak, but the words that seemed so simple in her head didn't sound the way she wanted them to. Every whisper of hers seemed insufficient to penetrate his indifference, as if she were speaking another language he just didn't want to hear. "And what You think you're entitled to just walk down this street when there are so many people waiting for you. Hey, as if he knew that every question he asked was digging deeper into her soul. Did not hurry to give her a chance to defend herself. Don't you realize that people like you only dream of breaking the law and cheating? I look at you and all I see is lies. Dana sobbed. Her tears were not an expression of weakness, they were the cry of a soul crying out for justice. She realized that his words were more than mere humiliation. They were a set of stereotypes that society had created about her, and she couldn't deal with them. Her pride was crushed, and the life she knew was forever blocked out by the dark shadow of his aggression. You can yell all you want, the policeman continued, throwing his head back, laughing as if it were the funniest joke, but you can't stop me. I can't hear you. It's just idle chatter. You know, you're out of your depth, and you don't have any friends in this town who can protect you. Please. Her voice was barely audible, as if he was walking away from her. I didn't do anything. I just want. Just what? He interrupted, leaning in closer, giving his voice a threatening tone. You want me to believe you had nothing to do with this? Really? You know how you people like you act. You think I don't see you shaking with fear? It just proves that you are a criminal who has no right to be trusted. Her heart ached at those words, and a growing despair filled her mind. She felt more than just a victim. She was a living example of the prejudice and hatred that corroded a society where her skin color determined her fate. Every moment, every sound, every whisper of the policeman was a witness to her humiliation, and she realized that she might not be able to get justice now. You can or you can't, he continued, enjoying her misery, but I know one thing for sure, all these problems are you, and we know what to do with people like you. You're just another case that needs to be closed. Dana felt her inner world crumbling, her hope fading away, leaving only hopeless darkness. The second she realized the hopelessness of this situation, she realized that this policeman was not just abusing his power, he embodied all the prejudice and hatred that should never have a place in society. Just when Dana thought it couldn't get any worse, the policeman suddenly straightened up, as if he had found a new direction in his evil play. His eyes filled with a fanatical gleam, and he spoke with such enthusiasm that he didn't even notice his voice growing louder, attracting the attention of passersby. You know what really annoys me, he said with obvious contempt. How people like you think they can roam the streets with impunity. You're always looking to make trouble. I've seen people like you before, always up to something, always dreaming of cheating. Aren't you ashamed? Dana recoiled from his words as if from a blow. Her mind was torn between anger and fear, and she struggled to find the confidence to refute his insane accusations. It's not my fault. I'm just going home, she breathed out, her voice sounding hoarse, but she tried to put as much strength into it as she could. But the policeman only grinned, as if her words only confirmed his argument. Oh, really? He teased her, tilting his head to the side. You expect me to believe that fairy tale? You're just like everyone else. You don't know what respect for the law is, and you hide behind your innocence. I just have to look at you to know that you're just like everyone else. Every word he said cut like a knife. He kept pushing, using his position to make her laugh. I'm sure you have some fun secrets, he continued, stepping closer to her. Maybe you've even been hiding something, or maybe you just don't want anyone to know what you really do when you're in the dark corners of this town. Her eyes went wide with shock, and Dana realized that he was just continuing to deepen his accusations without once thinking about what he was saying. He wasn't giving her a chance to defend herself, only making her feel even more helpless. Maybe you're involved in some kind of crime. His voice became sinister, and there was a joy of humiliation in his tone. You know, there are all sorts of nasty things going on in this neighborhood, and you could be one of them just by looking at me. Those words made her inner world crumble like a house of cards. Each of his questions was another broken piece of her soul. She didn't know what else to say, how else to defend herself. You have no right to say that, she almost shouted, though her insides clenched with horror. Right, he laughed loudly, as if the word was out of place in their conversation. You still don't understand where you are. In this world, rights are a privilege, and you're just a piece on a chessboard. You have no voice, no meaning, and at this point, you're just confirming all my suspicions. Dana's heart was pounding in her chest, her body trembling, but still she tried to stand on her feet, even though she felt like a doll that had just been strung by a soulless puppeteer. With every word he said, She felt her life crumpling under the weight of the prejudice and hatred that came from this man. "I can see how afraid you are," he said with triumph, "and that only makes me more suspicious. I don't even need any proof to know that you're not what you seem." And in that moment, as he looked at her with such blatant contempt, Dana realized that her fight wasn't just against him, but against a system that condones people like him and leaves defenseless victims in utter despair every day. As Dana continued to stand under the pressure of the policeman, passersby began to gather around, but their reactions varied. Some looked puzzled, wondering what was going on, but most preferred to just watch, as if this scene was a common sight in their daily lives. Her heart beat faster and faster as she realized that this entire audience didn't seem to have the slightest desire to intervene. Look at this little thing," the policeman continued with a sneer, pointing at her as if she were a trophy. "She doesn't seem to like being caught very much. Look at the aggression she's showing." Several people laughed, supporting his mockery. Their laughter ran in there, like a reminder that such acquiescence was part of their culture. She turned around, and her gaze met one of the passersby, who was looking reluctantly in her direction. His eyes threw sparks of sympathy, but he didn't seem to know what to do, and eventually just turned away, as if her suffering didn't concern him. "Nothing to see here," shouted the policeman, turning to the crowd. "Do you have anything to say? Maybe someone wants to take her side. Or do you mind when I clean up the mess, too?" No one responded. Only a few people recoiled, as if his aggression was something they were used to, something they had encountered before. They stood silently to the side, showing their acquiescence to what was happening. It wasn't just indifference, it was the hypocrisy of a society that chose to ignore the destruction of lives. "Yes, I see who the real bully is here," he continued, mocking. "I'm sure you can guess, too, that she's the one provoking us. Everyone can see how pale with fear she is. Just watch her." Some in the crowd began to whisper among themselves, expressing their displeasure. There were scraps of talk about "this behavior is unacceptable and it's just not normal," but their words had no power. They were just empty sounds, unable to influence the course of events. "Come on," a voice came from the crowd, and someone with a jacket over his shoulders came closer. "This is an outrage. You have no right to treat her the way you do." Dana felt a spark of hope flare in her, but the policeman immediately turned around, his face contorted with anger. "And who are you to give me advice?" he growled. "Are you going to interface with something you don't understand? If you knew who she was, you'd shut up." The other passersby began to glance around, and tension hung in the air. Some were embarrassed, but they still couldn't dare to step forward, unwilling to risk their peace for the sake of one girl. Everyone was on their own, shielding themselves from the excitement and confusion that was only growing. "She just wants to go home," the one who came to her defense continued to argue. "She is not a criminal, and you're acting like a tyrant. You must be out of your mind." The policeman laughed loudly, leaning on his credentials, and then addressed the crowd again. "If you can't see the problem, how can you expect me to see it at all? She's just another problem I can deal with whenever I want." Dana looked at the people around her, her hope slowly fading as she realized that even those who looked sympathetic were mere spectators, inactive witnesses to her humiliation. This moment was not just a confrontation with the police, but a reflection of a society that chose to remain on the sidelines rather than fight bias and racism. All these thoughts and feelings, all the tears and despair were building up inside her, but she knew that her voice would not be heard today. She was just one of the many who had been betrayed, and perhaps it was the only way to be alone with this darkness, surrounded by silent watchers. At the very moment when Dana felt her hopes finally fading, one thought arose in her mind of her father. She knew he had power that the policeman couldn't even imagine. He was a powerful judge who had spent his life fighting for justice and equality. Not knowing that his daughter was now in the hands of hate and bias, that thought suddenly filled her inner strength like a ray of light in a dark room. However, the policeman, immersed in his power, was unaware of who she really was. He continued to gloat over her humiliation, not realizing that there was much more to this situation than just a clash between him and one defenseless girl. He was consumed in his triumph, smug in his anger, and completely unaware that his indifference might soon lead to his downfall. "Look, I don't know how you ended up in this town, but you're clearly out of place," he said, gritting his teeth. "You think your daddy can save you? He's not here, and I'm the one who makes the rules." At that moment, Dana caught herself thinking that maybe her father could step in and change the course of this story. She took courage and, feeling a little stronger, said, "My father is a judge. He knows the law, and you can't treat me like this." The policeman, grinning, shook his head. He clearly wasn't taking her words seriously, and that undermined Dana even more. "Oh, really?" he said, with obvious sarcasm. "And you think that means something? Judges, lawyers, are they all here to protect people like you? You're just another problem to be fixed." But at that moment, there was a sudden sound that made him freeze. It was the sound of an approaching car, and with it came a wave of anxiety. Dana turned her head and saw a black limousine pulling up to the scene, the same one her father probably got into every morning on his way to work. Her heart thudded as a man dressed in a strict suit and a determined look on his face stepped out of the car. It was her father, who had just finished another court hearing. He walked quickly toward the crowd, his eyes searching for what was going on, and soon he spotted his daughter. "Dana," his voice sounded like thunder, his presence instantly changing the atmosphere. Dana felt a new sense of hope arise inside her. She finally saw that she had someone who could stop this abyss of humiliation. The policeman turned around, a look of incomprehension in his eyes as he saw the powerful judge coming toward them. Dana couldn't hold back the tears. She knew her father was here, and now everything was about to change. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking at the policeman with slight contempt. "Why are you treating my daughter like this? I demand an explanation." The policeman suddenly felt the tension building in the air. His confidence dissipated, and he answered, trying to keep his face straight, "It's no big deal, Judge. We're just having a preventative conversation. This girl's obviously acting suspicious." "Suspicious?" His father interrupted him, his voice as cold as ice. "Suspicious is when you have facts. You don't. You have no right to humiliate my daughter based on your own preconceived notions." The father's words came as a blow to the policeman like a thunderclap. The situation changed in an instant. Now he was the one in the position of having his actions questioned. Dana watched as her father, a strong and respected man, was able to defend her with the same passion he had defended justice in the courtroom. "I will file a complaint about your actions," he said, his voice strong and firm. "What you have done is unacceptable, and I will not let it go unnoticed." The policeman, realizing that he had no chance, tried to remain calm, but his voice no longer had that smug self-assurance. He realized that he was facing a man who could change the course of events. In that moment, Dana felt the burdens of the past begin to fall from her shoulders. She knew there was more to her life than fear and prejudice. She had support, she had strength, and she was not alone. Despite her father's presence, the policeman didn't seem ready to back down. His contempt continued to spread through the air like poisonous smoke, and in his gaze, you could read the hatred that ignited dark thoughts in him. He clenched his fists, trying to save face, but Dana could feel his whole being aimed at her, even as her father stood by her side. "Aren't you a little overconfident, Judge?" the policeman said with a touch of contempt. Addressing her father, "Do you think your cross can protect this little thing from justice? She's turning herself against society, and I won't let her get away with it." "Justice," father interjected with a bitter chuckle. "Justice is not just a word to cover bias. It is the foundation upon which we must stand, and your aggression is something that has no place in this society." But the policeman only waved it away, as if his father's words didn't matter. He wasn't going to remove his boundaries. He turned to Dana again, sparks glinting menacingly sharp in his eyes. "You think you can get away that easily?" he said, his voice low and sullen. "You know you have no defense. All I see is your skin color, and I'm not going to ignore it. You are the problem, and you will be held accountable for your actions." Dana felt a cold sweat run down her back. She didn't know what to do. Her voice was fading away again, as if there was nothing she could say to change his mind. Around her, the world was disintegrating, leaving only emptiness and fear. She couldn't believe that despite her father, she was still the object of hatred and prejudice. "You know what they do to you on the street," the policeman continued, approaching her. "Do you really think you can wander around here without arousing suspicion? People like you always look suspicious." With each word, Dana felt fear clench her heart. She realized that the policeman was blind to her humanity, to who she really was. In his eyes, she was just a reflection of prejudice, a concentration of all the stereotypes and hatred that society had accumulated. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice barely audible. "I'm just going home." The policeman only laughed, and it was a laugh full of contempt. "You know what annoys me the most," he said, as if he didn't notice her fear. "It's how you probably think your life matters, but in reality, it doesn't matter at all. In our society, your endeavors are useless." As if those words were sharper than a knife, they pierced her to the core. Dana felt her world crumble, and in that moment she was especially afraid. She realized that in his eyes she wasn't just guilty, she was defined by this crime before he even knew her. "You think there won't be consequences for what you've done," he continued, his voice growing more sullen and threatening. "Every time you go outside, you endanger yourself and everyone around you, and I'm here to remind you of that." At that moment, Dana realized that the world around her had become not only cruel, but hopeless. Every detail, every scene, every movement of passers-by seemed filled with judgment. A feeling grew in her that no one would understand her, that not even her father could save her from this evil. Every look, every whisper on the street was overlaid by her inner cry for help, but no one seemed to be able to hear her. Fear began to pull her under, and despite the strength that came from her father, Dana felt herself falling victim to this endless chain of prejudice. All she wanted was to be just a girl going home, but instead she was trapped in a cage of hatred and contempt from which there was no escape. Dana's father stood there in disbelief as his assistant, Judge Brown, told him what had happened. It was like a thunderclap. The news exploded in his mind, making his heart pound with rage. How could this have happened? His voice sounded like an explosion, full of anger and terror. "How could you let this happen in our city? It's not just a mistake, it's a clear abuse of power." Brown knew his friend was on edge right now. It tried to reassure him, but it didn't know what to say. The storm inside Dana's father was growing by the minute, and it was already getting out of control. "You must remember who I am," he said through gritted teeth. "I have dedicated my life to fighting for justice and equality, and that's not just my duty, it's my mission. And I will not allow anyone, including this policeman, to humiliate my daughter." Flames of rage flared in his eyes, and he began to imagine what the encounter with the policeman would be like. The image of this smug, self-satisfied man who hated her gave him a keen desire for revenge. He had always believed in law and order, but now his anger was turning into a desire for justice that demanded action. "I can't just sit idly by while my daughter is humiliated in front of passers-by," he shouted, causing confusion among his colleagues who were trying to calm him down. "This policeman has taken on the role of judge, jury, and executioner, and I will not let him get away with it." His voice was filled with such power that the others in the court began to back away involuntarily. They knew him as a man who had always chosen the path of the law, and now they saw his patience wearing thin. He was willing to do anything to protect his daughter and restore her dignity. "I'm going to sue that cop," he said, his words sounding like a sentence. "He must be held accountable for his actions. We have evidence, we have proof, and I'm not just going to let it go." His resolve grew stronger with each word, and he imagined how in the courtroom, the one who dared to touch his daughter with contempt would be on the dock. He realized that this would be a fight not only for Dana, but for all those who had ever suffered racism and prejudice. He was determined, and that determination was becoming his main weapon. "I will fight for every ounce of justice," he said, looking around the crowd as if urging them to take action. "This is not just my daughter's cause, it is the cause of the whole community. We must stand together against this evil that divides us." A huge flood of emotions overwhelmed him. He thought about how Dana, his little girl, was now facing this madness. She didn't have to endure this humiliation, and he realized he couldn't stay away. In that moment, he decided that he was no longer going to put up with this system that allowed police officers to abuse their power. He was going to do everything he could to not only get justice for his daughter, but also to change the way society perceived people like her. "I will not stop until I get justice," he said, his eyes burning with determination. This policeman and all those who support him must learn that racism and prejudice will not go away. I will make them realize that every humiliation comes with a price. His anger became the driving force that drove him to action. He knew he had an opportunity to change the world his daughter lived in, and he wasn't going to miss that chance. With that thought in mind, he headed for the exit, determined to confront the policeman and make him answer for his actions. When Dana's father reached his office, his anger had left him with only cooled embers, but in the back of his mind, the fire was still burning. ready to flare up again. He knew that the next step was to call the police station, and that was where his fight for justice would begin. Gathering his thoughts, he dialed the number of the local police station. Every buzz of the phone reminded him of the injustice his daughter had faced. When the on-duty officer's voice sounded on the other end, his heartbeat quickened. "This is Judge Michael Scott," he said, trying to make his voice sound confident and authoritative. "I want to speak to the precinct commander. It's urgent." "Judge, wait 1 minute," the duty officers replied, clearly frightened. The wait dragged on while he gathered his thoughts to say what he wanted to say. When the supervisor came on the line, however, his voice was full of formality, but there was a note of awkwardness in it. "Judge Scott, how can I help?" said the warden, trying to remain calm. "You can start by explaining how your officers allowed himself to humiliate my daughter for no reason," Michael said with a fury that left no doubt about his intentions. "This is unacceptable. I understand your concern, Judge, but sometimes police officers have to act on their instincts. They're trained to respond to potential threats." The chief began to justify himself, but Michael wasn't going to listen to this nonsense. "Potential threats? Are you telling me that the color of my daughter's skin is grounds for considering her a threat?" His voice grew even louder, and his anger boiled up inside him like an avalanche ready to tear down a cliff. "This is racism in its purest form, and I will not let it go unpunished." The supervisor faltered, realizing that the judge was right, but Michael continued, "I demand an immediate internal investigation and explanation. I'm not going to let this situation go. If you don't take action, I will file a lawsuit against your department for bias and abuse of power. I am not just a father demanding protection for his daughter, I am a man fighting for justice." Every word he spoke was like a blow, and with each utterance, the anger built up in him. He couldn't let it remain just words, it had to end in action. He knew that behind him stood not only his daughter, but many others who were victims of such prejudice. "Judge Scott, I understand how this may look, and we will certainly look into it," the chief replied, his voice sounding more cautious now. "I promise you that I'll do everything I can to get to the bottom of this incident." "Figure it out," Michael parried. "I don't just want to deal with it. I want this officers to realize that his actions have consequences. His behavior must be condemned, and he must be punished for humiliating my daughter." With those words, he hung up the phone, his breathing heavy with emotion. Michael realized that this was only the first of many battles he would have to fight, but he was ready to fight. This situation didn't just affect his family, it affected the entire community, and he intended to make everyone see how many people were affected by this bias. He had a plan, and he was going to carry it out. His thoughts were filled with the image of that policeman who dared to humiliate his daughter, and Michael vowed that he would avenge her suffering. No amount of aggression would stop him, and he would not let the incident fade into oblivion. Every time he thought about what had happened, his resolve only grew stronger. He knew he had the power to do something significant. With this new determination, he began to write a formal statement of case, gathering all the necessary evidence. He was ready to go all the way, and no one would be able to stop him. With each passing minute as the court hearing approached, Dana's father could feel the tension building. He knew it would be more than a legal battle. It would be a clash of two worldviews, a clash of truth and lies, of justice and bias. Father, who knew no fatigue, immersed himself in preparation, studying cases, gathering evidence, and preparing documents. He also did not forget the moral support that his daughter needed. When the day of the trial came, the courtroom was filled with tension. On one side was the father, determined, and on the other was the policeman, surrounded by his colleagues, who clearly intended to support him in this struggle. The judge, an elderly man with deep wrinkles on his face, Saturday on the throne of justice, preparing to hear both sides. "Scott V. O'Connor," he said, his voice commanding and clear, "please present your arguments." The father stood up, feeling the stares of many who had come to support him, including his daughter, who Saturday on the front row, her eyes full of hope. She looked for protection in his words. "Your Honor," he began, his voice confident but painful, "I am here not only as a father, but as a citizen who cannot remain indifferent to lawlessness. My daughter, Dana Scott, was humiliated and assaulted by police officers. O'Connor simply because of the color of her skin." He paused, letting his words reverberate through the room, and continued, pointing to the policeman sitting in the dock. This man used his power to intimidate and humiliate an innocent girl without any justification. He became judge, jury, and executioner at the same time, judging her by her mere appearance. Your Honor, this is a grave injustice. Policeman O'Connor, clearly under pressure, tried to look nonchalant, but his tense lips betrayed his inner turmoil. Your Honor, his attorney said, rising to his defense, my client acted in accordance with the laws and standards established for the performance of police duties. His actions were motivated by the need to maintain order and safety in the community. Safety, Dad parried, anger in his voice. Safety cannot be an excuse for bias and racism. He had no right to decide who was a threat to society based on skin color. It's not just neglect, it's a system that destroys lives. The judge listened attentively, his face expressing understanding and thoughtfulness. He was well aware that such cases were not isolated and how often such incidents were hushed up. Do you have any evidence to support your assertions, Judge Scott? He asked, looking around the room. We have the surveillance footage, Michael replied, confidently holding out the discs that contained the footage from the scene. I will also present the testimonies of the people who had unwittingly witnessed the incident. We object to this evidence, O'Connor's lawyer intervened, his voice harsh. It is only an interpretation of events and cannot be used as proof of my client's guilt. The judge blinked and there was silence in the room, but Michael was determined. Your nobility, he said, this evidence is essential to understanding the whole picture. We cannot allow bias to go unpunished, and I urge you to consider this material as evidence of a reality faced by many, not just my daughter. The judge nodded, and the room fell silent again as the video began to play. The screen showed a scene of a policeman pulling Dana over. There was not an ounce of respect in his actions, only humiliation and suppression. The father, watching his daughter become a victim of bias, felt his heart clench with pain. He could not stand by. And now that the world had seen this injustice, he realized that they were on the road to change. This is not just a case, it's a reality that many people face, he said when the video ended. And we must fight to ensure that such cases do not happen again. I demand justice not only for my daughter, but for all those who suffer under this system. The courtroom was filled with a buzz of discussion, and all eyes were on the judge who would decide what to do next. My father knew that their fight was just beginning, but he was willing to do anything for justice. The trial became a catalyst that attracted public attention, like a magnet for journalists, human rights activists, and ordinary citizens concerned about injustice. News of the Scott v. O'Connor case quickly spread across social media and news channels, and soon posters with slogans calling for equality and justice began to appear on the streets. People began to gather outside the courthouse, forming mass protests in support of Dana and her father. At every turn, voices were heard demanding an investigation, not only into the incident with the girl, but into the systemic racism entrenched in the police and society at large. Supporters began asking uncomfortable questions about how bias and discrimination are becoming the norm and how they can affect the lives of innocent people. We are not just against one police officers, shouted one activist, standing on a platform framed by placards. We are against the entire system that allows this to happen. It's time for the world to see the truth. On social media, discussions also gained momentum. Users shared personal stories of bias they themselves had experienced, creating a powerful stream of information that reached into people's hearts. Each post picked up the same thread: racism and bias is not something to be ignored. It was a reality that needed to change. Amidst the public outcry, Dana's father, Michael, was invited on several television programs to share his story. Each time he appeared on screen, his words awakened hope and anger in the hearts of viewers. I cannot sit idly by while my daughter is victimized by aggression just because of who she is, he said, his voice ringing with strong conviction. We must fight bias and protect those who cannot protect themselves. Michael felt his words resonate with his audience and realized that this was not only his personal struggle, but a movement that could touch the lives of millions. He encouraged people to unite, share their experiences, and create a platform for those who have suffered similar humiliations. Meanwhile, the hashtag #JusticeForDiana started on social media and quickly went viral. People from all over the world shared their stories, using the platform to denounce racism and call for change. Photos of protests, chanting slogans, and posts with personal stories filled news feeds, creating a wave of public pressure on the authorities. With each passing day, the case became more and more discussed, and many experts began conducting studies to find out how deeply entrenched racism was in law enforcement. Reports showed that such incidents were not uncommon, and it became evidence of a systemic crisis that required immediate action. Human rights organizations began organizing press conferences and roundtables to discuss the importance of creating training programs for police officers that could help them recognize their biases and work to overcome them. Dana's father was a frequent participant in such events, where his personal story inspired many by exposing the problem of racism. With each new day, the pressure on the police and the judicial system increased. And that was just the beginning. The realization that the system could be changed was a spark of hope, and everyone behind the fight knew they were on the right track. With each new voice that was raised and each new story that came to light, the movement grew, becoming more powerful. Michael, looking at the growing support and activism, realized that with each step they were getting closer to change. He felt that the justice he had been fighting for was just around the corner, but at the same time, he knew that the road would be difficult, and they still had many hurdles to overcome before his daughter and many others could live in a world free of bias and fear. As the case of Scott v. O'Connor continued to attract attention, the time had come when police officers O'Connor finally had to put up a defense. He knew the pressure from the public and civil rights activists was mounting, and this was his last chance to acquit himself. The courtroom was full, and every eye was on him as he stood up to give his testimony. "Your Honor," he began, his voice strained, "I was acting within my authority when I stopped the girl. I have a duty to keep the street safe, and according to the signals I received, her behavior seemed suspicious to me." Many of the people in the room grumbled as they listened to his explanation. O'Connor continued, his face a mask of confidence, though fear and excitement raged inside him. "I saw her walking down the street at a late hour, and given the recent incidents in that area, this caused me concern. I acted based on my experience and my duties as a police officer. It's not bias, it's an instinct for self-preservation." He rubbed his hands together, trying to tame the shiver that still lingered. O'Connor continued to insist that his actions were justified, and he did so with an insistence that was impossible to ignore. "I see it as part of my job," he said, his voice growing more and more arrogant. "It's not something I did just to her. I act in the public interest, and sometimes that requires sacrifice. Being a cop means making hard decisions." The audience reacted to his words. Michael, Dana's father, looked at him with disdain, realizing that this man still didn't realize how much his bias and hatred was distorting his perception. It was as if he didn't realize that his actions had already done a great deal of damage. "You talk about victims," he said, his voice loud and confident. "But victims are not only those who face crime. Victims are those who live in fear every day, waiting to be judged just because of the color of their skin. This is my daughter who had to go home without fear of being humiliated and abused." O'Connor's clenched jaw betrayed his inner irritation. He began to justify himself even more, his arguments becoming more convoluted and unconvincing. "I'm not a biased person," he asserted. "I'm just doing my job. If someone looks suspicious, it's my responsibility to check it out. It has nothing to do with racism. It's my responsibility." But disgruntled whispers could be heard in the audience. Michael and his daughter's supporters realized that the bias with which O'Connor viewed the world was deeply rooted in his own perception of people. They saw him making excuses for his actions, not realizing that his own words only confirmed the problem at hand. "You talk about suspicion," Michael said, raising his hand to get the judge's attention, "but you must realize that by presuming guilt based on appearance, you are only confirming your own bias. You're not only hurting my daughter, you're undermining the foundations of justice." O'Connor, however, persisted. His position remained unchanged, and he was not going to change his mind, even as the public began to realize the depth of his actions. "I didn't mean to humiliate anyone," he insisted, but his voice sounded increasingly uncertain. "I was just following protocol. Our job is about risk. It's not about skin color, it's about safety." His words provoked anger in those who heard, and it became obvious People began to raise their voices, expressing their dissatisfaction with his argument. The situation was escalating, and the tension in the hall became palpable. "You still don't understand," someone in the crowd interrupted him. "This is not about security. It's about control. It's about power. And it's about bias. You think you can justify your actions, but the truth is out there." The courtroom filled with a buzz, and even the judge looked puzzled. O'Connor still didn't seem to realize that his position was already lost, and that the public was beginning to reject his excuses. "I'm not biased," he repeated again, but now his words sounded much less confident than before. Every voice in the room grew louder and louder, and the public pressure that was building by the minute was clearly weighing on the policeman, making him desperate to defend his point of view, despite all the facts that contradicted it. O'Connor, not realizing that his attempts to justify himself were only deepening the problem, increasingly showed his true nature. Against the backdrop of this struggle, a feeling began to emerge in people's hearts that justice was getting closer. With each new word, with each new piece of evidence, the case of Scott v. O'Connor became an important symbol for the fight against racism and prejudice. It was only the beginning of a long road to change, but every step was important. When the day of the trial arrived, the atmosphere in the hall was permeated with tension. Every seat was taken, and the crowd was eagerly awaiting the start of what could be a landmark trial in the fight against racism and bias in law enforcement. Michael, Dana's father, was determined, his heart filled with a mixture of anger and pride for his daughter. He knew he now had an opportunity to expose the truth, and he intended to take full advantage of it. The judge, a man of solid reputation, began the hearing with a formal introduction, but his stern tone soon softened as he looked at Dana sitting next to him. He felt the weight of her suffering and realized that their fight was not just his father's case, it was his life's work. "Mr. O'Connor," the judge began, addressing the policeman, "you claim that your actions were necessary to ensure safety, but let's get to the bottom of what exactly happened that night." He handed the documents to his assistant, and the assistant began to read out the details of the incident. Every listener in the room frowned as the facts were stated, revealing the horrific details Dana had encountered. "You approached her without warning," the judge continued, looking up at the policeman. "You grabbed her shoulder without giving her a chance to explain herself. That moment of physical contact was the beginning of the humiliation she faced." A quiet whisper was heard in the hall. People realized that the events had unfolded not only as an offense, but as a personal trauma for Dana, who was still suffering the consequences. Michael felt anger ignite in his chest as he remembered how his daughter had been exposed as a potential criminal. "You said you had grounds for the stop," the judge continued, "but you didn't provide any convincing evidence. It was just an assumption, based on stereotypes inherent in your culture. You saw her skin color and immediately assumed she was a threat." The judge's words rang out like thunder. O'Connor clenched his fists, a wave of redness flooding his face. He couldn't hide the fact that his defenses were beginning to disintegrate before his eyes. "You should know that stereotypes are not facts," the judge continued. "They are only evidence of your own preconceived opinions, but it was those opinions that led to the violence and humiliation my daughter faced." He turned to Dana, and her eyes met his. There was a mixture of fear, pain, and hope in them. She felt her voice finally starting to resonate in the hall, and it gave her strength. "Tell me how you felt when that policeman approached you," her father asked. "I was scared," she said quietly, her voice shaking. "I didn't know why I was stopped, and when he grabbed me, I felt defenseless. I was alone, and I felt like no one was coming to help me. I just wanted to go home." Tears welled up in her eyes, and that moment was a turning point for everyone in the room. The judge, as a father, felt the depth of his daughter's pain and realized that it was stories like this that needed to be heard. He addressed the court, emphasizing that their personal struggles were not just about forgiveness and justification, but about exposing a problem that needed to be addressed immediately. "We cannot turn a blind eye to bias," he said. "We must confront it, or we will allow it to continue destroying lives. This case is a cry for help, and it needs our attention." There was silence among those in the room, and people began to realize how serious the situation was. This was not just a story about police and crime. It was a story about how bias and hatred can undermine the foundations of justice. O'Connor, feeling the pressure, tried again to justify himself, but his voice sounded uncertain, and his attempts to look professional fell apart before his eyes. "I was only doing my duty," he repeated, but it sounded more and more false. "I didn't mean to offend anyone." But the judge interrupted him, cutting off his last attempts. "Your Honor," he said with determination, "let's summarize. You failed to perform your duties properly. Your actions not only caused harm, but also undermine confidence in the police as an institution. How can you claim to have acted in the public interest when your actions have created nothing but fear and hatred?" The judge's words echoed around the room, awakening public consciousness and raising questions about systemic racism. Everyone realized that this was only the beginning of the road to justice. The trial continued, and with each new testimony, each new witness, more and more people realized how important it was to keep fighting to change not only this situation, but the system as a whole. Every word spoken in the hall became part of a larger struggle for equality, for a life free of fear and prejudice. This was not just a struggle between Dana and her father. It was a movement that had begun to blossom, and now it had a power of its own. As the case of Scott v. O'Connor continued to evolve, it became a matter of public discussion, generating strong reactions and divided opinions. Soon after the trial began, social media was filled with opinions from people all over the city. The clash of two worlds, those who supported Dana and her father and those who justified the police actions, became the center of the discussion, generating deep controversy and passions. On one side were activists, human rights organizations, and ordinary citizens who saw this as an opportunity to speak out against systemic racism and discrimination. They collected signatures on petitions demanding harsh punishment for O'Connor and reforms in the police force. There were rallies and protests calling for justice and equality. People with different flags and placards took to the streets, representing unity in the fight against bias. "We must stand up for our truth," said one activist at the rally. "Our lives matter, and we cannot let anyone suffer at the hands of those who are supposed to protect us. This is not just an incident, it is a symbol of the struggle for justice." Meanwhile, on the other side stood those who supported O'Connor. Many argued that the police officer's actions were justified and that he was simply doing his job. They saw the situation no longer as biased, but as a danger posed by young people in disadvantaged neighborhoods, and their arguments were based on fear and protective instincts. The policeman was just doing his duty, his supporters said. He could not have known she was not a threat. "We live in dangerous times, and we need tough measures to protect ourselves." This separation generated a lot of controversial discussions. On social media, the debate was heated to the max, with many users sharing their personal stories of facing discrimination and bias, while others continued to justify their previous opinions about the police. Dana, looking at all these events, felt a weight being placed on her shoulders. She realized that her personal tragedy had become a symbol of struggle, and her own experiences were on display for the world to see. The fear, humiliation, and despair she experienced that night continued to haunt her. She could feel the world around her dividing into camps, and this only added to her pain. At the school Dana was returning to, her classmates were discussing the case, and many tried to support her, but there were also those who questioned her judgment. Some found it hard to understand how this situation could have happened, and others saw it as an opportunity to blame the police officers without considering her personal feelings. "Why do you worry so much?" one of her classmates asked. "He was just doing his job." Those words were like a knife to the heart for Dana. She wanted to scream that her life was not just a job, that her pain and humiliation could not be justified by a superficial understanding of the situation, but instead she only nodded, full of sadness and a sense of helplessness. "You don't understand what this means," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. "This isn't just an incident, this is my life." That same evening, as the world continued to discuss the case, Michael felt that his daughter had become a target not only for the police officers, but for a society divided into two opposing camps. He saw how her suffering had become a public debate, and it left him uncomfortable. He felt he had to protect his daughter not only in court but also in society. "Dana, you have to know that you're not alone," he told her as they sat her day together on the couch. "We have to keep fighting, even when it seems like the whole world is against us." She nodded, holding back tears, and his words gave her hope, but that fear and tension remained. She felt that her pain and humiliation had become part of something much bigger, and it felt both hopeful for change and deeply sad that others might not understand her. Society was divided, but she and her father were united in their fight, and that gave them the strength to keep going even when the darkness around them seemed insurmountable. When the day of the verdict came, there was an atmosphere of intense anticipation in the courtroom. Everyone knew that this was more than just a trial. It was a moment when justice could be done and change could begin. Michael sat next to Dana, his heart pounding with excitement and anticipation. He felt that this was the culmination of their struggle. Policeman O'Connor stood in the dock, his face a mixture of anxiety and defiance. Throughout the trial, he had tried to justify his actions, claiming he was acting in the public interest. But now he faced a judge who, in addition to his professional position, was also a loving father, ready to protect his daughter at any cost. The court concluded that the defendant's actions were not only unreasonable, but showed clear signs of bias and abuse of power. The judge said, his voice sounding confident and clear, "O'Connor, your actions not only humiliated a young woman, but also damaged public confidence in law enforcement." At that moment, the hall was filled with whispers. People were whispering, realizing the seriousness of what was happening. Dana felt the pressure off her shoulders. She felt as if at this moment her personal story, her suffering and humiliation, were beginning to take hold. "Your Honor," said the prosecutor, "we demand punishment for abuse of power and racial discrimination. This is not just a mistake, it is a crime against justice and humanity." The policeman only gritted his teeth stubbornly in response, continuing to stand his ground. He didn't want to accept the reality that his actions had become the object of condemnation. But now that the case was in the public domain, he could not hide his inadequacy. "I acted on instinct," he said, his voice shaking with nervousness. "I couldn't have known." "You cannot justify your actions by instincts," the judge interrupted him. "Your instincts were based on stereotypes and bias. They cannot justify your aggressive actions against an innocent man." At this, the judge paused, looking around the room where people had already gathered ready to speak. He continued, emphasizing that O'Connor's actions had destroyed not only Dana's life, but also people's trust in the system set up to protect them. "We must understand that every human being, regardless of color, is worthy of respect and justice. We cannot allow bias to influence decisions made in the name of the law." As the judge pronounced his decision, the room filled with a buzz of emotion. Some sighed with relief, others were undoubtedly disappointed. O'Connor was found guilty of abuse of power and discrimination, and faced punishment, not only a fine, but the possibility of losing his job as a police officer. "We must remember that this case is not just about punishing one person," the judge concluded. "It is about systemic bias and the need to change our approach to justice." Dana felt tears come to her eyes. They were tears of grief, but also of relief. She realized that her pain, her fear and her humiliation had sent a powerful message to the community. Her story began to change people's minds and hearts. After the session ended, many people approached Dana and her father, expressing their support and admiration. People began to share their stories, telling how they too had faced discrimination and bias, and how important it is that such cases are not ignored. "Thank you for not being afraid to speak up," said one woman, her voice shaking with emotion. "Thanks to you, I realize how important it is not to be silent." Michael, watching the reaction of the people, realized that their struggle had not been in vain. Their story, Dana's story, had become a symbol of change, and although the prejudice and hatred still existed, he felt that a small spark of hope had already flared into a flame. The next day, local news stations covered the case, mentioning that the story would be passed on by word of mouth. It was a milestone in the fight against racism and prejudice, reminding everyone that everyone deserves respect and justice. Dana knew that despite all the weight and pain, her story was the beginning of something bigger. She was now ready to speak out, ready to continue the fight for equality and justice, not only for herself, but for everyone who had ever faced bias. She felt that the world was changing, and that they, as a family and as a community, were finally beginning to open their eyes to the reality in which they lived. And while the road to justice was still ahead, she knew they were not alone. Their story, full of pain and hope, was a cry for help that would be heard much farther away than they could have imagined. Thank you for spending this time with us and learning about this important story. Your opinion is very important to us. Share in the comments what you think about the situation described in this story. Have you experienced racism in your life? How have you dealt with such situations? Each of you is incredibly important to us, and we appreciate your support and participation. Don't forget to subscribe and like our channel so we can continue to share important stories with you. We wish you a good day.